Do not speak unless you understand what you're about to break, the voice had said, though no one could remember who first wrote it into the protocol. And Ethan Cole was thinking about that line when the hall began to feel wrong in a way that had nothing to do with gravity or air pressure and everything to do with expectation, as if the entire chamber had leaned forward without moving an inch while Queen Lyra stood before the ancient console, its surface alive with symbols that refused. Translation, a language older than treaties, older than the empire itself, the kind of system that didn't just process input but judged it. And one by one the royal translators had stepped forward, confident at first, then careful, then quiet, until even their confidence felt like a liability measured in inches of hesitation. And Ethan, who was not supposed to be there except as a redundancy no one expected to use, stood near the back adjusting the sleeve of a uniform that never quite fit right, telling himself that this was exactly the kind of day where doing nothing was the safest contribution, the kind of day where silence was a career strategy. Except the console pulsed again, a soft, deliberate flicker like a patient tapping its fingers, and the Queen's voice cut through the air, calm but edged with something sharper than frustration. Again, she said, and the lead translator tried. Voice precise, technically perfect, emotionally empty, and the system responded with nothing, not rejection, not acceptance, just absence, which was somehow worse, and Ethan felt it then, not a sound exactly. More like a pattern, like hearing a melody you didn't know you remembered, something in the cadence of the symbols aligning in his mind before he could stop it. And he exhaled quietly, almost annoyed with himself, because this was exactly how bad ideas started, with curiosity dressed up as competence. And under his breath, barely louder than a thought, he corrected a single phrase. Just a shift in tense, a minor adjustment, the kind of thing you'd fix in a spreadsheet without telling anyone. Except the console reacted, not dramatically, just enough, a flicker that felt like attention, and someone nearby turned, eyes narrowing, and suddenly doing nothing was no longer an option. You, a guard said, not unkindly but not negotiable either, and Ethan was escorted forward, with the distinct awareness that he had just volunteered for something without meaning to, and the hall seemed larger from the center, or maybe quieter, like the space had cleared room for a mistake. And Queen Lyra looked at him, not impatient, not curious, but focused, the way someone looks at a lock they intend to open. Repeat it, she said, and Ethan considered all the reasons not to, the complete absence of training, the very real possibility that he was about to embarrass himself in front of several hundred highly qualified witnesses. And then he heard the pattern again, clearer now, like a memory that had decided to stop pretending. And he spoke, not loudly, not bravely, just accurately, the language settling into his mouth as if it had been waiting there, the vowels compressing, the rhythm adjusting, the meaning carrying itself without effort, and the console lit. Not fully, not yet, but enough. The symbols aligning, the air tightening, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full. And somewhere to his left something metallic slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a sound that traveled too far, and Ethan stopped speaking, because continuing felt like trespassing, and the Queen stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant, her gaze fixed on him with a precision that made explanation feel inadequate. Why? She asked softly. Not how, not who taught you, but why? Does it respond to you? And Ethan, who had built a life on small answers and smaller expectations, found himself without one, watching as the console pulsed again, brighter this time, as if confirming a suspicion it had held for a very long time. And for the first time since he had entered the hall, he had the distinct and deeply inconvenient feeling that he was not the one discovering the system. The system was discovering him. The silence did not break, it deepened, like the room had decided that sound was no longer a necessary feature, and Ethan became aware of every small movement around him as if the world had slowed to a careful, deliberate pace, while the console continued its steady pulse, each flicker now slightly brighter, slightly more certain, as though it had moved from curiosity into recognition. And that word settled uncomfortably in his mind, because recognition implied history, and Ethan was fairly confident he had never been here before. At least not in any way that would explain why ancient alien technology seemed to be reacting to him like an old colleague. And Queen Lyra did not look away, her gaze steady, measuring, the kind of attention that made pretending difficult. "Say it again," she said, not as a command, not quite as a request either, but something in between that suggested the outcome mattered more than the process. And Ethan hesitated just long enough to notice it, the hesitation, the moment where a reasonable person would step back and allow someone more qualified to take over. Except no one else moved, no one volunteered, and that was its own answer. So he inhaled slowly and repeated the phrase, adjusting nothing this time, letting the structure settle exactly as it had before, and the console responded immediately, not with a flicker but with a shift, the symbols reorganizing into cleaner lines, the light stabilizing into a steady glow that felt less like activation and more like confirmation, and a low hum spread through the chamber, subtle but undeniable, like a system waking up after a very long wait. And somewhere behind him someone whispered something that did not quite reach the level of sound, and Ethan felt the weight of attention settle fully, not just from the court, but from the system itself, as if he had crossed a line he could not see until he was already standing on the other side of it. "You adjusted the cadence," one of the scholars said, voice tight with disbelief. "That is not a translation. That is interpretation." And Ethan almost smiled at that because interpretation implied intention, and he was not entirely convinced he had been in control of any of this. "It sounded wrong," he said simply, which was not an explanation, but it was honest, and the Queen's expression shifted by a degree so small it would have been easy to miss if not for the way the room seemed to align with her focus. "Wrong," she repeated softly, as if testing the word against something older than language itself, and then she stepped closer, closing the distance with an economy of movement that suggested she did not waste steps on uncertainty. And Ethan became aware of details he had not noticed before, the faint patterning along the edges of her ears, the way the light adjusted subtly around her as if the environment itself deferred to her presence. And she studied him not as a curiosity, but as a variable that had just become relevant. "Our translators study for decades," she said, her voice even, controlled. "And they cannot produce that structure." And there was no accusation in it, only fact, which somehow made it more difficult to respond to. "I did not study it," Ethan replied, which sounded inadequate the moment it left his mouth, because the alternative was worse, and the console pulsed again, brighter this time, the symbols expanding, layering into something more complex, and then a tone emerged, clear and precise, cutting through the silence with the authority of a system that did not require permission to speak. "Identity cross-reference in progress," the voice announced, neutral, clinical, and the words landed harder than they should have because they implied process, evaluation, something being measured against something else, and Ethan felt a small, unwelcome certainty settle in his chest that whatever the system was looking for, it was not expecting to find it in him. And yet the light intensified, the patterns locking into place with a finality that suggested conclusion rather than possibility, and the voice continued, unchanged in tone. "Pattern match detected beyond acceptable variance." And this time the silence reacted, not breaking, but tightening, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible had just occurred. And Ethan let out a slow breath he did not remember holding, looking from the console to the Queen, who had not moved, not reacted outwardly, but whose attention had sharpened into something unmistakable. And for the first time since this began, she did not look at him like an anomaly. She looked at him like an answer she had not expected to receive. No one spoke, because speaking would have forced the moment into something smaller than it had already become, and Ethan stood there with the quiet, inconvenient awareness that the system had just finished a sentence he did not understand, while the console's light stabilized into a steady, unwavering glow that no longer flickered like a question but held like an answer, and the air in the hall shifted, not physically, not in any way measurable in inches or degrees, but in expectation, as if everyone present had collectively decided that whatever happened next would matter far more than anything that had come before. And Queen Lyra finally moved again, not stepping back, not breaking eye contact, but turning slightly toward the console as though acknowledging it as an equal participant in the conversation, which, Ethan suspected, it very much was. "Define the match," she said, her voice calm, controlled, the kind of tone that did not ask for clarification so much as require it. and the system responded without delay, its voice carrying the same precise neutrality as before. Linguistic structure alignment exceeds recorded parameters for non-authorized entities. And Ethan blinked once because that sounded impressively official and deeply unhelpful at the same time. Non-authorized. One of the scholars echoed, louder now, as if volume might restore certainty. Then he is an anomaly. And the word moved through the room like a convenient solution, something that could be labeled, contained, filed away. Except the console did not dim, did not retract, did not behave like a system that had resolved an error. It remained engaged, attentive, which was not how anomalies were usually treated, and Queen Lyra's gaze returned to Ethan, sharper now, more precise. If you are not authorized, she said slowly, then why does it continue? And that was, Ethan thought, an excellent question, one he would have appreciated more if he had any intention of answering it, which he did not, mostly because he had no idea how, and he resisted the urge to say something unhelpful like I am just as surprised as you are because that felt insufficient given the circumstances. So instead he did what he had been doing since this began. He paid attention, listening not just to the words but to the pattern beneath them, the rhythm of the system's responses, the subtle pauses that suggested processing rather than performance, and he realized, with a clarity that was both useful and deeply inconvenient, that the system was not reacting to him randomly. It was responding as if he had already been recognized at some earlier point, some earlier context that Ethan could not access but the system clearly could, and that thought settled into place just as the console emitted another tone, softer this time, almost affirmative, and the symbols shifted again, reorganizing into a tighter configuration, more structured, less exploratory, and the voice spoke once more. Secondary verification required. And the words carried weight, not urgency, not alarm, but process, the kind of process that did not initiate itself without reason. And Ethan felt the attention of the entire hall narrow further, if that was even possible, as if every observer had collectively leaned closer without moving. And Queen Lyra tilted her head by a fraction, her expression unreadable except for the slight adjustment of her posture that suggested interest rather than resistance. Proceed, she said, and the console responded instantly, the light intensifying just enough to draw focus, without overwhelming it, and a new sequence of symbols appeared, more complex, layered with patterns that seemed to fold into themselves, and Ethan recognized them before he could stop himself, not consciously, not through study, but the same way he had recognized the earlier structure, as if the meaning arrived fully formed and simply waited for him to acknowledge it, and he felt that now familiar pull, that quiet insistence that he already knew what to do, and for a moment he considered ignoring it, stepping back, allowing the process to fail in a more predictable way, but the system did not dim, did not withdraw. It waited, patient, certain, and Queen Lyra watched him with that same focused intensity, not pressuring, not commanding, but expecting. An expectation, Ethan had learned, was far more difficult to resist than orders, and he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the charged stillness, and said, almost to himself, all right, before stepping closer to the console, aware that whatever came next would not be a correction or a coincidence, but something far more deliberate, and far less reversible. The console did not rush him, and that somehow made it worse because urgency could be ignored, but patience felt deliberate, like the system already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for him to catch up to it. And Ethan stepped closer with the distinct awareness that distance had been a form of safety he no longer possessed, the surface of the device shifting subtly as he approached, the symbols reorganizing in a way that suggested accommodation rather than reaction, and he stopped just short of it, close enough now to see the fine detail in the patterns, the way each line carried not just meaning but intent, layered structures that felt less like language and more like architecture, and he realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that this was not something designed to be translated. It was meant to be understood directly, and that realization arrived with a familiarity he could not explain, as if he had encountered this logic before in a context that refused to surface. And behind him the hall remained perfectly still, no whispers now, no movement, just attention held at a level that made the air feel thinner, and Queen Lyra did not interrupt, did not question. Her presence steady at his side, not close enough to intrude, not distant enough to disengage. The exact distance of someone allowing a process to unfold while fully prepared to intervene if necessary. And Ethan lifted his hand without thinking, then paused, because touching ancient alien technology felt like the kind of decision that usually came with consequences measured in more than inconvenience. And he let his hand hover for a moment, considering the possibility that restraint might still be an option. Except the console shifted again, the light focusing, narrowing into a precise point. Directly beneath his palm, not moving toward him, not reaching, simply aligning. And that was the moment he understood that this was no longer a question of whether he should engage. The system had already accounted for that hesitation, and with a small exhale that sounded more like acceptance than confidence, he placed his hand against the surface, and the response was immediate, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but exact. The light adjusting to match the outline of his touch, the symbols, stabilizing into a configuration that felt less like activation and more like recognition. And a low harmonic tone spread outward, not loud, not intrusive, but present in a way that seemed to resonate through the structure of the hall itself, like a note held just long enough to be felt rather than heard. And Ethan kept his hand steady because moving it suddenly felt like interrupting something that had been waiting far longer than he had been alive. And the system spoke again, its voice unchanged, but its timing precise. Biometric correlation in progress. And that phrase landed differently than the others, less abstract, more personal, and Ethan found himself watching the surface beneath his hand, as if it might offer some visible explanation for what was happening. Except there was none, only the steady alignment of patterns that continued to refine themselves with quiet efficiency. And a moment later the tone shifted, subtly, the kind of change most people would miss, but impossible to ignore once noticed, and the voice followed. Correlation exceeds baseline parameters, and behind him someone inhaled sharply, the sound small but unmistakable in the stillness, and Ethan resisted the urge to look back, because turning away now felt like breaking eye contact in the middle of a conversation he did not fully understand, and Queen Lyra stepped closer by a fraction, just enough that he could feel the change in proximity, her attention fixed not on the console but on him, as if the device had already said everything it needed to, and what mattered now was how he responded to it. "Remove your hand," she said quietly, not urgent, not alarmed, but deliberate, and Ethan did, lifting his palm away slowly, half expecting the system to dim, to disengage, to return to whatever dormant state it had been in before this began, except it did not. The light remained, steady, resolved, the patterns holding their configuration as if the interaction had not ended but progressed to something else entirely. And the voice spoke once more, final in a way that suggested completion rather than continuation. Authorization recognized, and the words settled into the hall with a weight that did not need amplification, and Ethan stood there for a second longer than necessary, looking at the console, then at his hand, as if one of them might offer clarification, before glancing toward the Queen, who met his gaze without hesitation. And for the first time since this began, there was no question in her expression, only certainty, measured, controlled, and far more dangerous than surprise. The words did not echo, and that made them heavier, because nothing in the hall dared to repeat them or soften their meaning, as Ethan stood there with the quiet realization that whatever had just been recognized was not something he could politely decline. And the console remained illuminated behind him, steady and resolved, like a door that had opened and had no intention of closing again. And for a moment no one moved, not the scholars, not the guards, not even the subtle background systems that usually hummed with quiet activity. It was as if the entire structure had paused to confirm that what had indeed happened, and then a single voice broke the stillness, controlled but no longer entirely composed. "That is not possible," one of the senior scholars said, the words carefully chosen but already losing their authority as they traveled across the room. And Ethan almost nodded because he agreed. This was very much in the category of things that should not be possible, except the system had not asked for permission before deciding otherwise, and Queen Lyra did not look at the scholar, did not acknowledge the objection. Her attention remained fixed on Ethan with a precision that made everything else in the room feel secondary. "Authorization is not granted lightly," she said, her voice calm, carrying without effort, the kind of tone that did not need volume to command attention. This system predates our current empire. It recognizes only what has already been proven. And there was a subtle shift in the way she said proven, not emphasis, not quite, but something that suggested the word carried layers beyond its usual meaning, and Ethan found himself resisting the urge to respond with something unhelpful like "I assure you nothing about me has been proven," because that felt insufficient given the circumstances. And instead he did what he had been doing since the moment this began. He paid attention, watching the room, the reactions that were trying very hard not to become reactions, the way the guards had adjusted their posture by a fraction, no longer just watching him but accounting for him, the way the scholars had stopped thinking in terms of translation and started thinking in terms of implication, and implication, Ethan knew, was where things became complicated. There must be an error. Another voice said, quieter this time, less certain, as if even the suggestion felt fragile, and the console did not respond to that, did not dim, did not retract. It simply remained, present and unbothered, which somehow felt like the most definitive answer of all. And Queen Lyra finally stepped back, not retreating, but creating space, the kind of space that allowed a decision to exist without immediate pressure. And she regarded Ethan with a different kind of focus now, not the sharp curiosity from before, not the measured skepticism, but something more deliberate, something that had already begun to settle into conclusion. You will remain, she said. And it was not framed as a request, not softened into suggestion. It was a statement, simple and absolute, the kind that reorganized everything around it, without needing to explain itself. And Ethan blinked once, because that felt like the kind of sentence that usually came with discussion, context, possibly an exit strategy, none of which were currently being offered. I was not planning to leave immediately, he said, because humor had a way of making difficult moments slightly more manageable, even when it did nothing to change the outcome. And for the first time since this began, something shifted in the Queen's expression, not a smile, not even close, but a slight adjustment, a micro-softening that suggested his tone had been registered rather than dismissed. That is convenient, she replied, her voice still controlled but no longer entirely distant. And she turned slightly toward the council, her presence expanding to fill the room in a way that made it clear the moment of uncertainty had passed. Prepare a private chamber, she said, and the instructions moved through the hall instantly, carried by systems and people alike. Efficient, unquestioned, and Ethan became aware that the focus of the situation had shifted again, no longer about whether he could do what he had done, but what that meant going forward, and that felt significantly more complicated. And as the guards repositioned, not surrounding him, not restricting him, but clearly no longer treating him as background, Ethan glanced once more at the console, half expecting it to dim now that its role in the moment had concluded, except it did not. The light remained steady, almost attentive, and he had the distinct and deeply inconvenient feeling that whatever had just begun was not confined to this room, not limited to this conversation, but something much larger, something that had already moved beyond his ability to ignore it. And as he turned back toward the Queen, who was now watching him with that same precise, unwavering attention, he realized that for the first time in a very long time, being unnoticed was no longer an option. The hall did not empty quickly, and that was the first sign that this was no longer a normal conclusion, but the beginning of something people did not yet know how to leave, because even as orders moved and attendants dispersed with efficient precision, no one truly disengaged, their attention lingering in subtle ways, in delayed steps, in glances that lasted half a second longer than protocol allowed. And Ethan found himself standing at the edge of movement rather than inside it, escorted but not confined, guided but not controlled, which was a distinction he appreciated more than he expected given the circumstances. And as he walked the length of the chamber, the architecture seemed to adjust around him, not physically, not in any way that could be measured, but perceptually, like a space recalibrating what it considered important. And he resisted the urge to look back at the console again, because there was a certain finality in not checking, as if acknowledging it too often might confirm something he was not ready to understand. And Queen Lyra moved beside him without hurry, her presence steady, deliberate, not speaking immediately, which felt less like silence and more like timing. and Ethan recognized that pattern, the difference between someone who had nothing to say and someone who was deciding exactly when to say it. And the corridor beyond the hall carried a different kind of quiet, less ceremonial, more controlled, the kind of quiet that suggested layers of systems operating just beneath awareness. And for a few steps neither of them spoke, which gave Ethan just enough time to consider the list of questions he did not know how to ask without making things worse. And then she did, her voice low but clear. "You are not surprised." And it was not quite an accusation, not quite an observation, but something balanced between the two. And Ethan almost laughed at that, because surprise felt like an understatement. "I am trying to prioritize my reactions," he said, which was true, if not particularly helpful. And she glanced at him, not dismissing the answer, not fully accepting it either, her attention precise in a way that suggested she was listening for what he did not say as much as what he did. "Most would have asked what it means," she continued, her tone measured. "You have not." And Ethan considered that, the expectation embedded in it, the assumption that meaning should come before function, and he shook his head slightly. "Meaning tends to arrive after consequences," he replied. "I prefer to understand what already happened first." And for a brief moment something shifted again in her expression, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable, a recognition of alignment rather than agreement, and she slowed her pace just enough that he matched it without thinking, the two of them moving through the corridor in a rhythm that felt less like escort and more like conversation. And ahead the doors to a smaller chamber opened without being asked, the systems anticipating rather than reacting, and Ethan stepped inside, noting the change immediately, the space quieter, more contained, the kind of room designed for decisions rather than displays. And he turned slightly as Queen Lyra entered behind him, the doors sealing with a soft precision that suggested privacy rather than confinement. And she faced him fully now, no distractions, no observers, just the two of them and the quiet certainty of what had already been set in motion. "The system does not make mistakes," she said, not as reassurance, not as warning, simply as fact. And Ethan nodded slowly because that had become increasingly obvious. "That is what worries me," he admitted, and she studied him for a moment longer, her gaze steady, unflinching, before speaking again. "Then you understand the problem." And Ethan exhaled quietly, because understanding the problem was not the same as having a solution, and in this case it felt very much like the beginning of something that would not allow him to remain uninvolved. And as the room settled into silence once more, he had the distinct impression that whatever explanation he was about to receive would not simplify anything, only make it more precise. Queen Lyra did not sit, and that alone told Ethan this was not a conversation designed for comfort, but for clarity, the kind that did not soften edges or offer gradual understanding. And she remained standing across from him, posture precise, presence steady, as if the room itself had aligned around her authority. And for a moment she said nothing, studying him with that same measured attention, not searching for weakness, not testing for deception, but evaluating consistency, as though he were a system she intended to understand rather than a man she intended to judge. And Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but to remind himself that he still existed independently of whatever the console had decided he was. And finally she spoke, her voice calm, controlled. "The system you interacted with was not built for translation," she said. "It was built for verification." And Ethan nodded slowly because that matched what he had felt, even if he had not had the language for it at the time. "Verification of what?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral, because this felt like the kind of question that could become complicated very quickly, and her gaze did not waver. "Lineage, authority, continuity," she replied, each word placed with deliberate precision, as if removing any one of them would alter the meaning entirely. And Ethan let that settle for a moment, turning it over carefully, because lineage suggested history, authority suggested power, and continuity suggested something ongoing, something that did not end simply because he did not understand it. And he exhaled quietly. "I do not have any of those in a way that would interest your system," he said, which felt like a reasonable statement based on every piece of information he had about himself. And Queen Lyra tilted her head slightly, the movement subtle but intentional. "The system disagrees," she said, and there was no emphasis, no challenge, just fact, which made it harder to dismiss. and Ethan almost smiled. At that, because arguing with an ancient verification system felt like the kind of activity that would not produce useful results. Then your system has access to records I do not, he replied, and for a brief moment there was that shift again, that slight adjustment in her expression that suggested he had said something correct in a way that mattered. Yes, she said simply, and the word carried more weight than it should have, as if it confirmed not just information but implication, and she stepped closer, not invading space, but reducing distance, her attention narrowing further. That system only activates at full capacity under specific conditions, she continued, conditions that have not been met in generations. And Ethan felt that familiar, unwelcome certainty settle in again, the sense that he had just become relevant to something much larger than himself. And now they have, he said, not as a question, because it clearly was not one, and she inclined her head by a fraction, acknowledgement rather than agreement, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was structured, like a pause placed deliberately between two statements that needed separation to be understood, and Ethan glanced briefly toward the sealed doors, then back to her, because leaving was no longer a practical consideration. You said it verifies lineage, he said, choosing his words carefully. What exactly did it verify? And for the first time since this began. Queen Lyra did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she was deciding how much to say, and that decision, Ethan realized, was far more important than the answer itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, not weaker, but more precise, as if the words required a different kind of control. It verified that you are not external to this system, she said, and Ethan frowned slightly, because that was not how most people described him. I am very external, he replied dryly. I arrived here this morning, and for a fraction of a second, something almost like amusement touched her expression before it settled back into composure. You arrived here today, she corrected, but that is not the same as being external. And that distinction landed in a way that felt more significant than it should have, and Ethan felt the quiet shift in his understanding, not a full realization, not yet, but the beginning of one, the sense that whatever the system had recognized was not about where he was from, but where he fit, and that was a far more complicated question, and as the room settled into another measured silence, he had the distinct impression that the next answer would not explain him. It would redefine him. The distinction did not settle easily, and Ethan found himself standing in that quiet space between what he knew and what the system had already decided, the kind of space where certainty felt less like an answer and more like a pressure that had not yet resolved into form. And Queen Lyra watched him with that same precise focus, not impatient, not expectant, but attentive in a way that suggested she was measuring how he processed rather than what he concluded, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that did not solve anything but created room to think. So I am not external, he said, more to test the shape of the idea than to challenge it, but I have no memory of being anything else. And she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without correcting it, which somehow made it more significant. Memory is not the system it verifies, she said, her voice even, controlled. Continuity is, and that word again, continuity, returned with more weight this time, like a thread he had missed earlier that was now being placed directly in front of him, and Ethan frowned slightly, because continuity implied connection, sequence, something that carried forward even when the surface appeared unchanged, and he considered that for a moment, then shook his head lightly. You are describing something that sounds like inheritance without awareness, he said, and for the first time she did not respond immediately, her gaze sharpening by a fraction, as if the phrasing mattered, and then she said, yes, and that single word landed with a clarity that made it difficult to dismiss as abstraction, and Ethan felt a quiet shift in his thinking, not agreement, not acceptance, but the recognition that the explanation was consistent with what had happened so far, and consistency, he had learned, was often more important than comfort, and he glanced briefly at his hands, as if they might offer some visible indication of whatever continuity the system had detected, but they remained exactly as they had always been, which was not particularly helpful, and he let out a small, almost amused breath. I am going to need a better definition of what I inherited, he said, because if this was going to continue, He preferred to understand the rules rather than guess at them. And Queen Lyra stepped closer again, not dramatically, not abruptly, but enough that the distance between them felt intentional rather than incidental. And her voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in tone, as if the next part required a different kind of precision. The system you activated was part of an original network, she said. One that predates our current classifications, our current divisions, even our current understanding of species boundaries. And Ethan felt that settle in a way that was both intriguing and deeply inconvenient, because anything that existed before definitions tended to ignore them entirely. And she continued, it was designed to recognize compatibility at a structural level, not a cultural one. And Ethan blinked once, because that was a very specific distinction, and one that carried implications he was not sure he liked. Compatibility. He repeated, testing the word carefully. With what? And this time she held his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, composed, but no longer distant. With the system itself, she said, and that answer did not simplify anything. It expanded it, turning the problem from identity into function, from who he was into what he could interface with. And Ethan felt the quiet realization settle that whatever this was, it was not about proving he belonged to her world. It was about proving he could operate within something that existed before either of them had a name for it. And the room seemed to tighten slightly around that thought, not physically, but in focus, as if the conversation had moved from explanation into implication. And he let out another slow breath, because this was the point where most reasonable situations offered reassurance. And this one clearly had no intention of doing that. And what does the system do with someone it considers compatible? He asked, keeping his tone even, because the answer mattered more than his reaction to it. And Queen Lyra did not look away, did not soften the response. It does not reject them, she said. It integrates them. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but precise in a way that left very little room for misinterpretation. And Ethan stood there for a moment, letting that single concept expand in his mind. Integration, not access, not permission, but inclusion at a level that suggested permanence. And he realized with a clarity that felt both obvious and deeply inconvenient that this was no longer a situation he could observe from the outside, because whatever the system had recognized, it had already decided he was part of it, and systems like that did not usually ask before they acted. The word did not feel like a threat, and that was what made it unsettling, because integration implied acceptance without negotiation, a process that did not pause for permission or wait for agreement. And Ethan stood there with the quiet understanding that whatever line he had crossed earlier had not been a boundary, but an entry point. And the room seemed to hold that realization with him. The silence no longer uncertain, but structured, as if it had shifted from observation into confirmation. And Queen Lyra did not move away, did not lessen her focus, her presence steady in a way that suggested she had already accounted for this outcome long before he had even arrived. Integration is not immediate, she said, her voice measured, precise, as if each word was placed to prevent misunderstanding rather than create it. And Ethan let out a small breath he had not realized he was holding, because that at least implied time, and time was something he could work with. That is reassuring in a very limited sense, he replied, the dry edge of humor returning not as defiance, but as a way to maintain balance. And for a fraction of a second that same subtle shift touched her expression again. Not approval, not amusement exactly, but recognition of something familiar in his tone. And she continued, it requires alignment, she said, systems must agree on compatibility before deeper access is granted. And Ethan nodded slowly because that sounded like a process, something structured, something that followed rules rather than instincts. And rules, even unfamiliar ones, were easier to navigate than undefined expectations. And if they do not agree? He asked, keeping his voice even, because this felt like the kind of question that mattered more than the answer might suggest. And she held his gaze without hesitation. Then the process halts, she said, and there was no emphasis, no warning, just fact, which somehow made it more significant. And Ethan considered that, the implication that this was not inevitable, that there was still a variable involved, and he found himself focusing on that, because variables meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant possibility, and possibility, even limited, was preferable to inevitability, and he glanced briefly toward the sealed doors again, then back to her, because the room itself felt like part of the equation now, not just a location but a participant in whatever was unfolding. And he said, "You said the system predates your current classifications," choosing his words carefully. "Does that mean it recognizes things your empire no longer tracks?" And her expression did not change, but her attention sharpened in a way that suggested the question had landed exactly where it needed to. "Yes," she said, and that single confirmation carried more weight than a longer explanation would have. And Ethan felt the pieces begin to align, not fully, not clearly, but enough to form the outline of something larger, something that connected the language, the response, the verification, into a structure that extended beyond his understanding of identity. And he exhaled slowly, because this was the point where most people would ask what he was, and he realized with a quiet, inconvenient clarity that she was not asking that question at all. She already knew the answer, in a way that did not rely on his explanation, and that was far more significant than anything he could say. And the silence settled again, not empty, not uncertain, but complete, as if the conversation had reached a point where the next step was not discussion but action. And Queen Lyra finally shifted her stance, a small movement, precise, controlled, and said, "You will undergo the next phase of verification." And the words were not framed as a command, but they carried the same certainty, the same quiet authority that had defined everything since this began. And Ethan nodded once, not because he fully understood what that meant, but because he had already learned that understanding was not a prerequisite for what came next. And as the doors behind him opened with a soft, seamless motion, revealing a corridor that seemed to extend farther than it should, the light within it steady and deliberate, he had the distinct and deeply certain feeling that whatever the system had recognized in him was not something that would remain contained within a single room. And as he stepped forward, aware of the Queen's presence just behind him, not guiding, not pushing, but ensuring, he realized that this was no longer about whether he belonged here, but about what would happen now that the system had decided he did.